Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, we're going to go back to our favorite inspired by oversimplified channel, Things I Care About. He's got 43,500 subscribers. I'm honestly surprised it isn't more. And I think as he gets more content out there, it probably will go up because I think he does a fairly good job with his videos, which are inspired by oversimplified, but cover some topics that oversimplified hasn't covered yet. So we're going to take a look at his two-part series on the Korean War. We'll do part 1 today, and we'll do part 2 tomorrow, but we'll make the second part available a day in advance to all of our patrons and members, as we often do when we do a series like this. So I'm interested to dive into this topic. The Korean War is not one I know a ton about, but I feel like we're going to all be learning more. Our friend Indy Nidell, who is a fan of this channel, and I've had an opportunity to speak to him a number of times, and hopefully one day we'll collaborate in some way, is starting a channel about the Korean War. And I'll put a link down in the description so you can check that out. By the time this video goes live, he should have some content up as he launches that channel. But this is something we don't talk enough about. My own great uncle, my grandpa's brother, served in the 15th Infantry Regiment of the 3rd Infantry Division during the Korean War, and described to us some of what he saw, which was pretty horrific stuff at times. So I'm anxious to learn what I can. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Thank you to Surfshark for sponsoring this video. More on them later.
The Korean War, June 25, 1950 through July 27, 1953.
With all this help, North Korea got ready and surprised everyone with an invasion in 1950.
The North launched a surprise invasion of the South on June 25, 1950.
On June 25, 1950, 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army rushed across the 38th parallel.
I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it. Let's cut the bullshit and propaganda. Let me tell you what really happened. Saying that the Korean War started when the North invaded the South is an oversimplification that doesn't really help us understand the conflict.
And we've said this before, and I'll say it again, that it's one of the tricky things about history is when you're telling a story of a historic event, especially one that lasts several years, where do you start? Because all of history is connected. How can you tell a story about World War II, for example, without talking about World War I? How can you tell a story about the Franco-Prussian War without talking about the Napoleonic Wars and talking about the Schleswig-Holstein War, for example? So you always have to kind of figure out. So I'm not gonna give a lot of grief to other channels who choose to start on that particular day, because it is a good, neat, defining moment to start with. And no matter where he chooses to start it, we're gonna have the same issue. Where do you start?
After all, the Korean War was originally a civil war. Did Abraham Lincoln start the American Civil War when he invaded the South? You're goddamn right he did. States' rights, brother. No. Civil wars are complex issues, and there's usually no single starting point. But we can begin by looking at the Korean society of the late 1800s.
Okay.
It was divided into a handful of powerful landowners and a massive amount of poor farmers who,
And in other words, it was like a lot of places in the late 1800s.
barely made enough to scrape by, with practically no middle class to speak of. They also had a complicated neighbor. For many years, Japan minded its own business and was closed to the outside world.
Who can we blame for this? America.
Hello, Mr. Japan. I am Commodore Perry. I come on behalf of the United States of America. You may have heard of us, greatest country on the planet. I'm here to start trading with you guys. Wow, we're flattered, but I'm afraid we're not really interested in trading with anyone. Oh, I'm so sorry. Don't worry, it happens all the
Get
time.
out the guns.
No. I'm sorry you thought I was asking. What? The Japanese were humiliated and forced to accept. Then they did what any reasonable nation would do: beef up their military, start a war with Russia, beat Russia, start a war with China, beat China.
So Japan at that time, and obviously this is all oversimplification, it transitions from kind of that Bushido, that samurai warrior mentality in society, the warrior class, the people who are warriors from birth, and they go to a modern kind of conscript army where you can kind of see a heavily fictionalized version of all that went down with the movie The Last Samurai with Tom Cruise, but that's when they're transitioning and modernizing, and when that door got opened to the outside world and they ended their isolationism, suddenly they're like, wow, there's a whole lot of stuff out there, we should get some of that stuff because everybody else is getting all that stuff.
And then go on a murderous rampage as you pillage and plunder everything in your path. And Korea was very much in Japan's path.
Yep.
They imposed a series of unfair treaties upon Korea and gradually increased their influence until they formally annexed it in 1910. The Japanese attempted to erase Korean culture and eventually prohibited the Korean language. If Koreans wished to continue speaking their own native language, they were forced to hide their identity. Koreans resisted through guerrilla warfare, but also through intellectual movements and peaceful demonstrations.
Maybe stop being jerks.
Which time and time again were brutally suppressed. The Japanese occupation of Korea closely resembles the Nazi occupation of France during World War II due to its brutality, control, and long-lasting effect on the occupied country.
So this is a fascinating thing to think about, because when we think about Japanese aggression, we tend to look to the 1930s with them moving into China. But it actually happened decades before that in the aftermath of the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan wins, and then of course Japan kind of nominally gets involved in World War I on the side of the Allies. They don't really contribute a ton, but they want in on the post-war world that is going to be made out of all of this. And so they really do go from isolationism to really just jumping out on the world stage big time. And it is important for us to think about this, just as when we talked about Vietnam, we can't talk about the Vietnam War without talking about French occupation that happened first and how that shaped what happened next.
In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, an area of China with many ethnic Koreans, and Korean resistance intensified as they formed more decentralized guerrillas and secret societies. Within a few years, a man who took the name Kim Il-sung rose as a prominent guerrilla leader. After witnessing the failure of peaceful demonstrations and the unrelenting brutality of the Japanese, Kim had become convinced that armed struggle was the only possible solution to the occupation. Kim was a vital part of the fight for Korean liberation, but his figure would later be enshrouded by disinformation. That is not the real Kim Il-sung. Kim was a hero. This man is nothing but a lookalike, a lying fraud propped up by the communists to deceive you into slavery. That's ridiculous. This is the one and only Kim Il-sung who bravely resisted the Japanese, blew up the Death Star, and threw the One Ring into the fiery pits of Mount Doom from whence it had come. The truth probably lied somewhere in between.
It often does.
To solidify their occupation, the Japanese implemented a carrot and stick system. Collaborators, who were mostly aristocrats, got the carrot and were often rewarded with special titles and powerful positions. But dissidents got the stick. The Japanese formed the National Police, which included many Korean collaborators. This police force was tasked with destroying resistance at any cost. They ruthlessly slaughtered anyone suspected of being remotely friendly to guerrillas, and the word guerrillas was a very broad and vague term.
Anybody who the neighbor implicates, haven't we seen that before?
I see here that you have been a loyal subject to the Japanese occupation. Wonderful, you get a carrot. Wait, it looks like she still owes a tax payment from last season. Yes, I'm so sorry. Between the harsh winter and my landowner's cut, I didn't have any surplus. Is that so? Or are you lying and trying to undermine our rule? Are you secretly part of a guerrilla? Give me that. You, young lady, get the stick. During their occupation of China and Korea, the Japanese slaughtered millions of peasants and committed acts so atrocious that I cannot talk about them without getting the $sign stick.
The $sign stick. The yellow $sign means that you're demonetized. Well, not demonetized, but restricted.
Guerrillas fought bravely, but they remained mostly decentralized and disorganized. In 1941, a massive Japanese counterinsurgency operation killed almost 200,000 freedom fighters, almost completely wiping them out.
And what happens when you come down so heavily on people is you start to create a lot of resentment and anger, and you start to cause those people who otherwise might be law-abiding citizens who played by the rules and would not have done sort of things to start to become extreme themselves in response. And you're creating the vacuum of power that people are going to fill into and become brutal on their own right.
Kim Il-sung saw this disunity as the main culprit for their defeat, and in him arose a new conviction. If Korea is ever to be free from outside occupation, we need unity by any means necessary.
By any means necessary. So now, that's exactly what I was just saying. You're creating an equal and opposite reaction. They're extreme, so now in order to fight that extremism, we've got to be extreme in our own way, and that means creating unity no matter what. Well, no matter what's a pretty broad term.
There can be no dissidents and no political alternatives. From now on, it will be my way or the highway.
So all you are is you are the polar opposite of the exact same crap, just coming at it from a different angle.
Fighting continued until Japan surrendered in 1945. The US occupied the southern half of Korea and the USSR the north. Well,
and people might look at that and say, well, why is the Soviet Union even involved in this? Well, there had been an agreement when the Allies were meeting to discuss what the post-war world was going to look like before the war was even over, that after Germany surrendered and the war in Europe was over, that the Soviet Union would guarantee that by a certain deadline they were going to enter the war against Japan. And they did that right at the tail end, just in time to get involved in the post-war world.
Now that the war is finally over, it is time to let both Koreas unify once again. Of course, I would want it no way else. But what will you do about the country's politics? Will it be capitalist or communist? Capitalist.
There you go.
When the Allies arrived at Korea, they found plenty of local people's committees established in the country, which proclaimed the People's Republic of Korea, led by the Christian nationalist Cho Man-sik. In the north, the Soviet Union ensured that communists found their way to positions of power, and Kim Il-sung soon emerged as the leader of the new republic. But in the south, the US refused to recognize the People's Republic of Korea and even outlawed the People's Committees. Instead, they created the United States military government in Korea, with MacArthur as the supreme commander. The US occupation of Korea would be chaotic, as not a single US troop or general spoke Korean. There was a running joke among the locals that it was actually the translators who were running the country. For over 1,000 years, Korea had always been one nation. The division was created and enforced by foreign powers.
Same thing that happened in Europe, right? You've got the Eastern Bloc nations like Poland and Yugoslavia and Hungary and Romania that all kind of fall under the sway of the Soviets. Winston Churchill called it the Iron Curtain that had descended upon Europe, but the same thing's happening in the East.
And Koreans on both sides of the parallel wanted nothing more than to see their country unified once again. But there was another matter to resolve: what to do with the war criminals from the losing side of World War II. Let's see, you Nazis are guilty of killing millions of innocent civilians in the Holocaust, conducting horrible lab experiments, sentencing millions into forced labor, and starting a devastating war that ravaged the continent. You are all sentenced to either death or a long time in prison. Aww.
I think I know where he's going with this.
Except for you, and you. You are coming with me. Alright,
Scientists.
now for you. You are guilty of killing millions of innocent civilians, conducting horrible lab experiments, sentencing millions into forced labor, and starting a war that ravaged the continent. Not mentioning that you forced between 200 and 400,000 women into sexual slavery for your soldiers. No, no, no. Bad Japan. Bad Japan. No more, okay? No more. Do you pinky promise no more genociding?
There were a number of people who were executed, including Hideki Tojo, who was the Prime Minister of Japan during all of this. So it wasn't like that. quite, but I get he's trying to make an extreme point that there wasn't quite the eradication of leadership that had done things like there was in Germany.
I pinky promise. Great, that's settled then.
Wasn't quite.
Unlike with Nazi Germany, Japan was allowed to maintain its power structure and faced no war crime persecutions.
So just to clear this up right now, saying there were no war crimes prosecutions is absolutely false. Here you have the International Military Tribunal for the Far East. This is kind of the Japanese version of the Nuremberg trials. You've got 28 defendants in this case. I think Nuremberg started out with 20. And you have different levels of defendants. In the end, you had 6 who were, of that 28, these are kind of the top ones now, are sentenced to death by hanging for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and crimes against peace, including Hideki Tojo and a number of other generals, another prime minister who was later foreign minister. You have a 7th who was sentenced to death for war crimes and crimes against humanity, 16 defendants sentenced to life in prison, and then more than 5,700 lower-ranking personnel were charged with conventional war crimes in separate trials convened by Australia, China, France, the Netherlands, Philippines, United Kingdom, and the United States. By 1949, you have a total of of the 5,700 Japanese individuals indicted for Class B war crimes, 984 sentenced to death, 475 life sentences, 2,944 more limited prison terms. So to say there were no war crimes, I'm not going to let him get away with that. In fact, I was doing a little more digging afterwards, and there were only a little over 500 Germans who were either executed or sentenced to life in prison for war crimes during the war. So comparatively speaking, the Japanese got hit a lot worse than the Germans, which makes sense because I think there probably were a lot more Japanese that were responsible for those kinds of war crimes than there were Germans. But dang. Okay.
The communists in the north executed many of the highest-ranking Japanese collaborators and allowed others to flee the country. The North also redistributed land to the poor, nationalized key industries, passed several sexual equality laws, and created a national program to provide free healthcare to every citizen.
Free healthcare. Free.
But the South did no such thing, and Japanese collaborators remained in positions of power to the point that the South Korean bureaucracy was indistinguishable from the one under Japanese occupation. Even the infamous National Police remained operational as the...
I'm getting the impression between this and his Vietnam video that my man might be a little biased toward the North in both of these scenarios. Sure seems to be singing the praises of North Korea right now. All right, let's see how it goes.
The US and the new South Korean military government worked together.
Listen, I'm not saying that South Korea is absolved from from being terrible. I'm not saying their government wasn't also terrible. But to spin it this way, I don't know.
To exterminate the remnants of the guerrillas that had once fought against the Japanese. This was a massive slap in the face to ordinary Koreans who lost loved ones to the Japanese occupation. Okay, we gotta find a way to reunify Korea. Absolutely. But who will be in charge? How about this guy? He is an activist for Korean independence and widely liked in both the North and South. That sounds right, but wait a minute. Is he a communist? Yes, but he's one of the most popular figures in Korea. No, not him. Okay, how about we both leave and we let them figure it out by themselves? God, no. What if they choose communism? No. Let's just let the United Nations figure it out. How about you guys leave and we supervise elections? You? No way. You're basically America's fan club. Okay, then how about...
Soviet Union had a veto on the United Nations Security Council, though.
We hold elections, but only in the South. That's a great idea. This was, in fact, a terrible idea. The US brought Syngman Rhee to Korea from his exile in the United States to become president. But many Koreans rightly saw these elections in the south as the beginning of a permanent division of the country, so they boycotted and demonstrated against it. The inhabitants of Jeju Island, mostly leftist, were particularly active in their protest against the elections, and right-wing youth organizations began to terrorize the island. Many of these terrorists had worked for the Japanese occupation, and now they exerted extreme violence against the local population. In Hagui village, they captured a pregnant 21-year-old woman named Moon, whose husband was allegedly an insurgent. They dragged her from her home, stabbed her 13 times with spears, and left her to die with her baby half delivered. Other women were serially sexually abused, often in public, and finally blown up with a grenade in the vagina. As demonstrations demanding unification with the North intensified, the US military government deployed the national police to suppress them. The police arrested 2,500 people in Jeju, and the islanders later found the dead body of one of them and realized that he had been tortured to death. This was the final straw. On April 3rd, people revolted along the northern coast of Jeju and attacked 11 police stations. After the elections, in which Syngman Rhee won by an inconspicuous 92.3% of the votes, the incident
sounds kind of like how the votes go in the north, too.
Escalated, leading to the death of 35 police and rightists. The US took a direct role to assist the newly formed South Korean Republic in eliminating the insurgency, using the same tactics once used by the Japanese. The islanders were massacred, leaving 60,000 dead. Of the 400 villages, only 170 remained. The right-wing youth organization was given control of the island, and by 1949, 300 of them had joined the island police, and another 200 were either in business or local governments. But elements of the South Korean army stationed in Yosu had refused to embark for Jeju to kill their fellow Koreans, so President Rhee set out to crush them as well. The US was even more involved in this operation. Its intelligence was vital in the planning of the operations, and the US Navy was responsible for transporting Korean troops. Among the US supervisors was James Houseman, who would spend 3 decades operating in Korea and later called himself the father of the Korean army. The violence of the suppression made him call the Korean army and national police brutal bastards and worse than the Japanese. Oh my god, what have you done? If you burn their bodies with gasoline, you can hide the method of execution and even blame the death on the communists. It is hard to grasp the scale of the violence in South Korea during this time. Guerrillas made brutal assaults on police, who then took the guerrilla fighters to their home villages and tortured them for information. They then shot them and tied them to trees as a lesson for the rest. Yet despite the brutal methods, the insurgency persisted. After all, the South Korean insurrectionists had good reason to be upset. While the North had implemented social and land reform and taken some steps towards gender equality, the social structure of the South remained as unfair as ever. And not only had the brutal Japanese occupation gone completely unpunished, but the new administration had protected and even elevated Japanese collaborators.
I'll be curious to see what he does have to say about the North. If not, we'll take a look at it ourselves in a minute here.
And now that it seemed the country's division would be made permanent, brutal violence was once again exerted upon them. It is estimated that 100,000 Koreans were killed in the South from the political violence. President Rhee forcefully enrolled about 300,000 people into the Bodo League, a national re-education program for suspected communists. All of this before the Korean War as we know it had even begun. This is just one of the reasons why I get so upset when people begin discussing the Korean War in 1950. Well, things I care about, but what about the communists? For the past couple of decades, North Korea has been a brutal dictatorship. Amnesty International has documented forced labor camps holding between 1 and 200,000 people, and around 600,000 North Koreans died in a Great Famine in the 1990s. But North Korea in its origins was vastly different, and we do not currently have evidence of North Koreans killing their enemies in the large numbers that we saw from the South and the United States.
So I've been doing a little bit of reading just to kind of come up with a few examples of things, because I feel like if he wanted to really be balanced in all of this, he could have at least, if we're going to spend a good bit of time talking about the atrocities that absolutely did happen in South Korea during that time, to just whitewash the North and say, well, in North Korea, everything was great and they were taking care of their people and none of that stuff that's happening today was happening back then. Well, from 1949 to the mid-1950s, under Kim Il-sung, all churches, Christian churches, were closed. All non-foreign Catholic priests were executed. And Protestant leaders who did not renounce their faith were purged as American spies. Benedictine monks were martyred on a large basis. Only 60 out of 400 Buddhist temples survived the persecution. 1,600 Buddhist monks were killed, disappeared in prison camps, or forced to recant their faith. And as I've been reading, there's a lot of other stuff going on. There was no room for any dissent. People were sent to camps. They were imprisoned, many times executed if they disagreed with the communist government because it was done for the good of the people. So anything you're saying about the South, it might not have been as well documented because the communist regime kept that stuff quiet because there's no freedom of the press there at all. It just got out more in the South. I'm not saying it's even the same, but to say the South was bad and the North was good at the time, don't give me that. Makes me a little uneasy about the direction of the rest of this, but we're going to try to slog through it.
The North Korean leadership was mostly happy to just let them emigrate. With help from the United States and the Soviet Union, both Koreas militarized rapidly, and the North sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to help the Chinese Communist Party in their civil war. Millions of people migrated across the 38th parallel to live in the government of their preferred ideology, polarizing the countries even further. The North viewed the South as a puppet government of a foreign power, no different from what it had been under Japanese occupation, and wished to liberate it and unify under its rule. The South believed that the North was a totalitarian communist regime that posed a threat to its democratic way of life and the future of a unified Korea. Skirmishes soon broke out across the 38th parallel. Problem: your sponsor won't help you if you launch an unprovoked general attack. Solution: provoke an unprovoked attack. Yep. The superpowers tried to deter a civil war. The US did their best to keep hot-headed Southern commanders from going buck wild. But go back wild they did. According to internal American accounts, much of the extensive fighting along the border was started by Southern forces, but the North was more than happy to strike back. On May 4th, 1949, the South attacked the North's position at Kaesong. In early August, the North attacked units occupying a small mountain north of the 38th parallel, killing hundreds. The only question was which Korea would lose patience and strike first. There is some debate about what happened next. I'll let the armchair historian explain the official US version.
Observing this weakness, Kim Il-sung began to believe that he could rapidly invade and conquer South Korea. Eventually, Sung launched his invasion, but claimed to his dying day that it was a righteous response to a surprise attack from the south, which was conveniently defeated so decisively by the Korean People's Army that no evidence of the invaders was left.
But in reality, there is indeed some evidence. Here are some South Korean and international sources that back up this theory. Whatever the truth may be, the North decided to invade, and we finally get to this point.
On June 25, 1950, 75,000 soldiers from the North Korean People's Army rushed across the 38th parallel.
Korean Popular Army forces assaulted the 1st Regiment of the Republic of Korean Army south of Chorwon, inflicting heavy casualties. The ROK 7th Division was stationed at the strategical town of Uijeongbu, and they had not joined the battle even by the morning of June 26th, probably because it waited for reinforcements by the 2nd Division. But when the 2nd Division arrived later that day, it quickly collapsed and the South Korean troops panicked. A hole opened up in the Uijeongbu corridor and North Korean troops poured in, moving closer to the capital.
Yeah, and this is the thing, the South Korean capital in Seoul is so close to the border that it's in a really precarious position if there's a surprise attack or a very overwhelming attack. And that's kind of how Korea this war goes early on. It's a series of it's like the opposite of World War I, where you had like little movements here and there. It's like boom, boom, boom. Like the Korean War is massive movements as the landscape changes, as different sides pour troops into it.
Fearing a popular uprising, President Ri ordered the massacre of the Bodo League members. South Koreans killed between 60 and 200,000 of its own citizens. Many of these people were not even communist, but had been enrolled to comply with Ri's high quotas. The South Korean government and its American allies initially attempted to put the blame on the North Koreans, and it wasn't until the 1990s that the Truth and Reconciliation Committee managed to establish the truth. Morale in the South Korean army was already low because of their lack of firepower and poor training, especially compared to the hardened North Korean veterans who had recently returned from China. Ri's government had become increasingly unpopular, and many soldiers despised their officers who had served the Japanese. As people across the South took up arms and harassed the South Korean army from the rear, countless ROK units mutinied and fled. In these dire conditions, Seoul could not hold any longer. President Ri had promised to stay in the capital, but fled the city aboard his special train. The army and police began a chaotic retreat, during which they blew up the Han River Bridge without warning, killing hundreds of their own police, military and civilians who were crossing it. Before the police abandoned the capital, they massacred between 4,000 and 7,000 political prisoners. Americans photographed and recorded the incidents, but did nothing to stop them. These killings were also initially blamed on the communists. The capital fell quickly, and the North continued its advance. During the Battle of Daejeon, President Ri once again addressed his people. My loyal subjects, know that I wholeheartedly believe in you and your ability to defend the nation.
I don't think they believe in you anymore, dude.
That is why I have decided to stay here in Daejeon until the very end. Wow, that means so a lot to us. Maybe we judged him too soon. That's great. Go Ri! Wait, where is he? Once again, President Ri broke his promise and escaped far away from the front lines. Military morale evaporated and civilians panicked. Within a week, half of the ROK soldiers were dead, captured or missing, and almost 70% of the total military equipment of the South had been lost.
And part of what makes this warfare, I mean, there's a couple of things that make it ebb and flow the way it does. Number one is the fact that you're fighting on a peninsula and you've got that very defined border because you've got bodies of water on both sides. So there's a very defined and contained front line that can be pushed back and forth. It's not like you're fighting over thousands of miles of front. And then, of course, you have, the South is on the verge of collapse and only holds a little sliver, and that's when the United Nations forces come in. United Nations forces turn the tide, it pushes all the way up into the north, and then the Chinese forces come in, so it has this back and forth.
General MacArthur visited the front lines and concluded that the ROK army had mostly ceased to fight.
Yeah.
The Civil War could have ended right here. Korea unified once again under North Korean leadership. It could have been just another in the long list of civil wars in developing nations.
That's true. He's right about that, but the nature of the aftermath of World War II is one of this idea for the Western allies of containing communism from spreading, this domino theory. It's why Korea happens. It's why you're going to have the conflict in Vietnam. It's why you're going to have places like Afghanistan. You're going to have the Cuban Missile Crisis, all of it. So I guess we're going to wrap it up right there. Listen, this is not a topic that I am confident enough in my knowledge of to be able to push back or to agree with in different areas. I just am going on my overall sense that it felt very much praising the North and demonizing the South. Recognizing, of course, that I am an American, which means I have a natural bias toward my own country, even though I know my own country has done some pretty awful things and supported some pretty awful people in the last century. So I'm not saying he's wrong. I'm just saying it felt that way. So let me know, those of you who know a lot more about this topic, am I right? Am I wrong? Is there more we could be saying about the bad stuff that was going on in North Korea as well? Is he overstating the stuff in the South, or was it actually worse in the South than what he's saying? This is an opportunity for all of us to learn and to get to the bottom of this together. And we'll come back with part 2 tomorrow. Thanks for watching.